Welcome back to Questing Beast. I'm Ben. Today I am joined by two other YouTubers from around the D&D YouTube sphere. I have Kelsey from the Arcane Library, and I also have Jordan from the Jordan channel. The PH is silent. It's the best way I can describe it. Why don't the two of you go around and just give a brief overview of who you are and where people can find your stuff and what you do. Jordan, do you want to go first?
Yes, so I am Jordan with silent PH in the middle. Terrible marketing, I know. It was a choice that was made a long time ago. I have a YouTube channel on Dungeons and Dragons lore. It kind of started out with the Forgotten Realms, but I cover a bunch of other stuff. I finished a spelljamming series, so if you're interested in Spelljammer, there's a whole bunch of information on that. Just trying to keep dungeon masters from having to read or feeling like they are expected to know all of this stuff. You can watch a 5-minute video and get a gist of it and go play a game. So there we go.
Great. And Kelsey?
Hi, yeah, I'm Kelsey Dionne. I run like a little publishing house called the Arcane Library. So I write for 5th edition and for old school style games. And I have a little YouTube channel. And I do videos about adventure design and game design, and then just walkthroughs of stuff I've written to try to explain my design process behind why I wrote them in such a way. So that's what I do.
Fantastic. Yeah, one of the reasons I want to have both of you on here is I noticed that both of you have seemed to start moving into the OSR sphere a little bit more than you were before. At least that's what appeared to me. So I wanted to talk to you about like your journeys and your experiences doing that, as well as answering a bunch of different questions from our viewers. But before we do that, quick shout out to today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Into the AM and their series of fantasy and sci-fi themed t-shirts. Into the AM has been a long-term supporter of this channel, and I really like their t-shirts. They're really soft, they're really comfortable, and they last a long time. The one I'm wearing right now is one of my favorites. It has this black hole design that I think works really well if you're running any sort of sci-fi or horror themed campaign, like Mothership, for example, or even something like Traveler. They have a deal going on where for $60, you can get 3 t-shirts in a bundle. And then if you use my link in the description below, you can get an additional 10% off their entire web store. Thanks again to Into the AM for sponsoring. Now let's get back to the show. And we're back. Let's look at a few of our questions. Actually, you know what? I have a question that I wanted to ask first, and that was what I just mentioned before. Do you want to just talk about sort of your role-playing game experience? Like, how did you get into role-playing games? What different games or editions did you go through? And where do you see yourself now? Kelsey, do you want to do that first?
Yeah, Ben, it's so nice of you to indulge me on this question because I've never really talked about my origin story with D&D like in a setting like this before. I've written a teeny bit about it, but it's funny because I actually grew up in southern Wisconsin in the 90s, and so I was playing D&D at this local game store, and like all the TSR people would come there and play D&D. And so it was crazy. The first adventure the first campaign that I started playing in was being run by James Mishler, who's this like very like old school. He's been working in the industry, I think, since he was in his 20s. And he's the living authority on the Wilderlands of high fantasy. And he was running games for us. And like he was in Gary Gygax's weekly game at the time. And so I just didn't know I was like surrounded by old school stuff growing up. And then kind of, you know, I left my hometown eventually and then went through the editions of D&D and all the way up through 5th edition. And I was kind of like, something feels like it's missing to me. And that's actually what led me back toward the old school Renaissance. I was like remembering what it was like to like play in the city state of the Invincible Overlord and all these. And I was like, what's missing? And it's the OSR that kind of gave that feeling back to me. So that's why I'm moving in that direction now.
Very cool. Jordan?
I didn't get into D&D until I was 33 or so, 32. So I missed out. I was always into fantasy, and I read a lot of books and things like that. I think I even read a bunch of Dragonlance novels, not really understanding that they were tied to a game. But I grew up in a very, very small town in Utah, and then pretty much moved to other small towns after that. So if I was going to find people to play Dungeons and Dragons, it was going to be like maybe one other person, and it's kind of like, oh, you're like the weirdo person. Like, it just wasn't that well known growing up where I lived. And it wasn't actually until I started listening to the Acquisitions Incorporated that Penny Arcade did. And I was just like, this is hilarious. And people are like, they're just having fun. And this, you know, this sounds so cool. And so I got a bunch of friends and tried to get one of them to Dungeon Master because I really wanted to play. And they were all like, no. And that's when I made the decision that I'm like, if I want to do this, I have to be the one that is willing to run the game. And so I bought a bunch of 4th edition stuff because that was like the latest one. And I'm like, okay. And then we sat down, we played 4th edition. And I think it was like a couple of years later, 5th edition came out and we switched over. And then since then, I started the YouTube channel around the time that 5th edition came out, because I noticed that as I was dungeon mastering, I had a lot of like, I don't really understand the world and like what happened with the history, and this is really confusing. And so I didn't really have the idea of like, I should just make it up on my own. For some reason, I was like, oh, we all play here. Like, I don't know. And so that's where the YouTube channel came from, is to try and like help me understand what I was running and if and why it was important. So yeah, I got into it later, but I like super fell in love with it. And now it's I got all these books and stuff. It's one of my favorite things.
Yeah, that's similar to what happened to me. I was always like aware of D&D growing up, but I didn't really get into it until, I don't know, like 8 years ago or so. And I don't know anything about D&D lore. Basically everything I know about D&D lore I've learned from your channel, which like I watch periodically. I'm like, oh, that's kind of cool. Because mostly I've been immersed in the old school Renaissance once I discovered that. Mm-hmm. And that is, despite being old school, a lot of it does not actually take place in a lot of the old settings.
Yeah, well,
people
I wonder if they could, because I think Greyhawk is still owned by Wizards of the Coast and stuff. So
yeah, that's true.
And the OSR, the whole point of it is to like make your own stuff and hack it. So it would be kind of weird to be like, yeah, we're going to revisit this old setting. I don't know, but
yeah. Well, I mean, you would just sort of expect that a lot of people's games and stories would be from like the old traditional settings, but people just love making up their own stuff so much that
yeah,
I just never got exposed to it. It's so interesting that Kelsey has like the most old school background of any of us.
Kelsey's the most experienced. 100%.
It's like my secret origin story. I've never even told anybody that story. Only the people who like I went to middle school with know that. So it's kind of funny, but
that's really cool.
We were playing D&D the same as everyone else. So it's not like it was like special, magical, crazy or anything. It was just like, in hindsight, it was interesting, I think. But
I have friends now that are like, oh, you just needed that weird uncle to like come in and drop like, you know, AD&D material. And I was like, yeah, all my uncles are farmers, and that was just not going to happen. So
dang it. Oh man. But okay. I came back to the game though, like maybe not even, I had taken a break from the game for a while. So I really got back into it seriously around the same time you guys did, really. So I had been on such a hiatus that it was almost like I was starting fresh.
When did you start writing adventures for it, Kelsey?
In about 2017 or so.
Okay.
So not that long ago.
Yeah. Was that your first experience writing adventures professionally, doing stuff for 5th edition?
Yeah. I had never done anything published before that point.
Yeah. It's around the same time I started writing too.
What did you write? I want to ask a question. I don't know your stuff. So would I recognize anything? Or
maybe some of it's on DM's Guild and some of it's just out on my website. But I wrote, I think the most well-known adventure I have is called The Secrets of Skyhorn Lighthouse. It's on DM's Guild. So if you're going to start anywhere, I guess that's a place to start. But it's an adventure about a lighthouse and eel people, and people liked it.
That's awesome.
And I saw you put in an adventure on the, the 10-foot pole contest a little while ago.
Oh, I did. Yeah. That's really the first contest I've ever done, but I respect that community so much. And I had an idea for something and I was like, for 3 days, like, should I do it? Should I not? I'm too scared. And then I just did it. And it actually turned out better than I thought it would. So I'm grateful that I decided to go for it.
Yeah, it won the best. So
I know. I was shocked. Anytime that happens, you have to like take a day off and drink champagne, and that's a serious day right there.
For sure. Let's jump into some of the questions submitted by some of our viewers. So the first one is from LFOSR, who is a publisher who publishes a lot of great OSR stuff. And he says, thank you all for the work you've put into your creations. Here's a question for Jordan, but I think it's generally applicable to everyone. What's a non-Wizards of the Coast setting or lore source that you really enjoy?
I mean, I don't like, I love Hot Springs Island, I guess. That one's really good. And the Weird in the Wild is another one, but I don't know if those are settings so much as like I will put Hot Springs in my game pretty much. If I need an island, that's like my go-to, or if I need like a really creepy dark forest, I'll get like the Weird in the Wild. So I guess I'll go with those. Like I really like those. I don't know, they're super, those are super good, like amazing books, amazing resources. I played a 5th edition campaign of Hot Springs Island, and then I have since started a Dungeon Crawl Classics game of Hot Springs Island. And I lost your video.
I know my video just went out. I can
okay.
Hold on. I'm gonna see if I can try and fix my video. Kelsey, go ahead.
Yeah, I I had to think about this one. I really like sort of micro settings, which is crazy. Like, because I really like having the freedom to, like slap my own stuff in. Oh, you're back. And I think most recently the setting that was not like WotC official that I ran was out of Knock magazine. I like literally have it. I need to look because I don't want to mistakenly credit it wrong, but oh yeah, by Gabor Lux, Gloomy Wood. And it's like this little micro hex crawl that's inside the inside flap of Knock #2. And I think I ran like 5 sessions just from like a couple rolls, and it's such a great little micro setting. I love that one.
Yeah, it's a really good
one. That
one.
would be my answer. Yeah.
I think the one that I've probably run adventures in the most is Dolmenwood, which isn't officially out yet. Their zines are out, and there's a bunch of adventures like Winter's Daughter, which is one of my favorites. But any adventure set in Dolmenwood, especially ones just written by Gavin Norman, are so good. They're so well written. They're so evocative. I just love like the mix of kind of whimsy and also darkness at the same time. It's just this really great balance. I
feel like that. Dolmenwood is the ideal way to have a campaign setting, because so often it's like, here's a big book and like, here's what happened the last like 100,000 years and stuff. But with Dolmenwood, it's like, here's a forest. Here's what's next to that forest. And the zines of it, I really enjoyed, because you get little slivers of it. But then by the end of that, you're like, oh, I actually know this pretty good. And this is a fun little setting. And it's really fleshed out in a lot of ways. But it doesn't seem daunting, I guess, where you're like, oh my gosh, I have to read how many books to get through this? You're like, oh, a zine. This is fun.
Yeah, it's really manageable. Especially if you get, the zines cover a bunch of hexes. I think if you're on the Dolmenwood Patreon, he's been giving out like the rest of the settings slowly. So you can pretty much run the whole forest now if you have access to that stuff. But the whole book, I think, is coming out maybe next year. So that's gonna be super exciting, because that's been like 8 years in the works.
Wow. I love that he's like, it's ready when it's ready. That's been his stance on it. And like,
yeah,
that's how you know it's going to be good.
And it's so pretty. Like the art is so good.
Yes. Oh, it looks so cool.
Let's see. Our next question is from Raul, who says, I'm a new DM. Our group meets 2 times a month. I find it hard to get a session to end at a place where the next session can start fresh. This means a lot of time is spent going over what happened the last time and getting everyone moving again. What advice would you give on how to structure the world or DM of the game so that sessions feel more self-contained or coherent? Anyone have any good advice for that?
I mean, having a base of operations is good. Like if you're a town, or if you're in a town and it's like, I have a house here and stuff, and then your adventure is to go out and do whatever, but eventually you're supposed to come back. And that's just practice for the dungeon master to understand, like, okay, I feel like this is going to be one 3 to 4 hour session. Unfortunately, you just have to play a lot to kind of figure that out. I feel like I can't tell you you like your players and stuff, oh yeah, they'll totally get through this. But the idea of at the end of the session being able to return home and like count your loot and stuff. And then we would always do that with certain campaigns that I've run. And then what's fun is in between, you can get on Discord and be like, oh, I want to, I don't know, go like steal from this guy, or I want to spread rumors or something. So they could affect the town during off time, like when you're not playing. And that's fun.
Yeah, It's tricky because I think it really depends on the kind of adventure you're running. Like if you're doing like a dungeon crawl, it's probably a little easier because I would just say don't end during combat. Like a really fun place to end is right before combat because it's a cliffhanger, or right after because that's a natural wrapping up point. And I mean, if you're doing like if you're doing an open table style game, which Ben has an amazing video about that, by the way. Yes, it's really good. And that, I mean, you can kind of just, I mean, I do this a lot where sometimes I'll just swoop my players a little bit at the end and I'll be like, okay, we're done for the day. You guys have completed a thing. So it's sort of between stuff. And then it'll be like, and it's time to go back to town, you know, which is a little bit, I mean, that can be a little bit heavy handed, but as long as everyone at the table agrees you're doing episodic style play in that way, then like no one's going to be mad about it. And then it's maybe a little more tidy instead of having to remember where you were in the dungeon. But
I'll also say that that's every table I've ever ran or played at is what happened last session? Like, where were we? And so that's normal. Don't feel like you're doing something out of the ordinary. So
true. So true.
Yeah, I think the easiest way is just doing things episodically. And that's, it's not something that if you play a lot of 5th edition campaigns, you're used to doing. But like the big campaign books just sort of go from event to event. They don't often have a base of operations. They don't have that like the picaresque style where each session is its own little mini adventure. You leave, you do something, and you go back again. That's pretty much constrained to old school style games that are very like loot focused, because it's about counting your loot once you get back again. So if you're not running like a loot focused game, that could be a little bit trickier in 5th edition to run a base of operations, because you'd have to find a way to wrap things up at a convenient point. I don't know how you would do things if you're running a more story-based campaign. That would just be tricky inherently.
You could say, here are your 5 MacGuffins. Here are your 5 monsters that you have to fight to get said MacGuffin.
Yeah.
And one MacGuffin leads to the next. I mean, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Then we're just writing adventures. So
I know.
Yeah.
What is like, I mean, I guess like cliffhangers are great. I know this seems painful, but a lot of times I've ended a session being like, you know, like roll a dex saving throw and then the player rolls and then I'd be like, and I'll tell you next time what happens. And then it makes people want to come back. Oh, we lost Ben again. This is like,
I don't know what's going on. This is very silly. Hold on.
Oh, this is just keeping us on our toes. You know, it's a test. Are you back? I don't see you.
No, I'll be back in a second. My camera just keeps turning off and then on again. I don't know why. It's never done that before.
No. Usually that's supposed to fix the tech, not break.
I know. This is very weird. Bad camera. Okay, let's just go on to the next one is, how do you go about making your homebrew setting unique and interesting? That's a very broad question. That's from Daniel Bennett. I guess I'm trying to work on a homebrew setting right now, and I'm trying not to worry too much about making it super unique and interesting. I've discovered that that's at least for me kind of a trap. If we spend too much time, especially reading a lot of the really great OSR settings, and then you sort of get stuck in your own head, like, this isn't weird or interesting enough, then there's no end to that. What I've discovered is that you can make things pretty darn vanilla and then just add like 1 or 2 strange things in there. And that's usually more than enough to keep players really interested. So I'm trying to actually dial things back in my own head just so that I can keep producing stuff. But in terms of coming up with good ideas, a lot of it, I think, is just reading a lot and watching a lot of movies and finding those inspiration sources that can fuel those weird ideas. And a lot of great resources for that is the old pulp novels that D&D came from, stuff like Dying Earth, Jack Vance, because those just have one weird idea after another, and you can just mine them for all sorts of stuff.
So yeah, 100%. I like, there's a book, well, it's over there on the shelf, but it's like Steal Like an Artist. And it's like every author reads, every filmmaker watches movies, and they are inspired by those. So I have my like little homebrew setting that I'm like, I think magic should work like vibrational physics from Kepler. Like the Johannes Kepler, he thought that the universe was in this like harmonic phase state and that everything was balanced in this way. And that was for me just watching like a YouTube video on it. And I'm like, that sounds really cool. And you start going on Wikipedia, and then all of a sudden you've got great ideas for your stuff. So just watch a movie, take a walk. That's quiet. And like, you'll come back with a lot of ideas.
Yeah. I agree with all of this. I think any artist is always kind of ingesting content and then turning it into something of their own. So I would say like it's really important to read source material and watch stuff that you think is cool. Like you make good material when you feel like it's cool, and so you want to have that like excitement around it. And I think that what Ben had mentioned, which also is the idea of like the writing technique of juxtaposition, where you're making something normal, like you're putting normal stuff in your world so that when there is something weird and stand out, then it really stands out. Because if everything's weird, then nothing's weird. So I think that's really important that you have a couple like pillar things that are unique and interesting about your world, but you want to also add some normalcy in so that it creates that impact.
Yeah, like you have all these farms, but instead of like bison or something pulling, not bison, but like bulls or something pulling your stuff, you have giant rabbits, and then it's like, oh, that's different. And so yeah,
and that'll stand out. But otherwise, like a semi-normal farm, so like that's really cool because the rabbits are like a very eye-catching thing then. So
for sure.
I think we lost you again, Ben.
I know. I can see when it goes out. I just have to turn my camera off.
Oh, good. Okay, I won't.
Very weird. My camera's never done that before. This is very perturbing. Anyway, yeah, so let's go on to the next question, which is just Jolie asks, as recent arrivals to the OSR scene, which I guess Kelsey is not, what kind of design ideas do you wish you saw more of in OSR materials? And what, if anything, have you done to include these things in your games?
Kelsey?
Well, I would call myself, yeah, and like I kind of am still new to the OSR scene technically. I would call myself like a wayward child of the OSR, where I came back to it after many, many years. And so I'm still kind of reorienting myself to it too. And so we're talking about like what elements we would, you know, I'm trying to think of the question. So it's like, what design ideas do we wish we saw more in OSR material?
Yeah. Do you feel like it's missing something?
Right. That's really interesting because that's almost like looking at later editions and then seeing is there stuff from later editions that we could pull back into the OSR. And I think yeah, that's a tough one because there's certain things that I think could always be streamlined about the older systems, like you know, Basic Expert. Like, I mean, there has been 50 years of game design since those were written at this point. So could we mechanically make some changes to improve the flow of the game? I guess, but people are also doing that. Like Ben's writing Knave and like I'm writing Shadow Dark, and people are, you know, OSE is like a beautiful cleanup of those rules. So I actually think the reverse would be better, to pull from the OSR into 5th edition. I can see a lot of opportunity for that, but I don't know. I don't see a lot I would pull from 5th into the OSR. I don't know. What do you guys think about this? Am I like on the right track here?
No, I think so. I'm trying to think of like, I don't think that there's really anything missing with OSR or something, because there's a game out there for everyone. Like you'll find the thing you want. But I guess like I like Magic, and I would like to have an all wizard or an all cleric kind of, maybe not a campaign like that, but something to the effect where Magic is well known and it's not like super scary. Because I read a lot of OSR books and it's like you're the only wizard of 4 that are in the entire land and things like that. And that's cool. That could be a lot of fun. I think Dungeon Crawl Classics does it really well, where you're scared of magic and magic can hurt you and things like that. But at the same time, it's like, what if we really understood it? Like that would be kind of fun. And then I don't know. So that seems to be a trope that I feel like a lot of not just OSR, but like a lot of settings in general are like magic is the unknown, maybe because it is unknown. So I don't know.
Right. Yeah. And like, I guess the other question too is like, are we including any of those elements, you know, in our games? Like, what are we pulling? And I suppose like one could say, like in my current games, the things that I'm pulling that might have originated in 5th edition, or maybe like streamlined ability checks, because I guess like the concept of ability checks are sort of like not necessarily a strict part of the OSR, and I think that there's a place for them. I don't think there's a place for skill checks, but that's a whole nother can of worms. But you know, that's just my opinion. So yeah, so I'd say like if anything that I'm bringing backwards in time, it would be a little bit more of the ability score impact on your ability to do stuff. But that's kind of, you know, that's kind of a feather touch right there. That's hardly anything at all. So
yeah, I mean, I think one of the big things that's being developed in the OSR right now is more procedures. So making things like a bit more board gamey and kind of like zooming out a little bit further so that you have like these sort of board game like structures that you're manipulating instead of just it being more on the game master. But apart from that, I can't think of any really big ones.
yeah,
I'm always curious about new mechanics though. So like I like the OSR a lot for that, because they're like, I made a weird table that utilizes this, and you're like, that's cool. You know, you don't see that in a lot of other. Well, I guess you don't see that in WotC publications because they have their formula of, you're familiar with the D20, so we'll just make a D20 table or something. And I don't know, it comes to mind is like, even I think it's in Knock as well, where it's like just drop a bunch of dice. Mm-hmm. And then depending on the number and where they land, and that's not something that you see a lot in 5th edition material, I guess. So
yeah, it's very interesting because I mean, like in 5th edition, just making a new class that sort of meets the bar for what can actually fit into the existing ones is like an extraordinarily difficult design process. Whereas in the OSR, you get like new classes are kind of easy to make because the goal is not game balance necessarily, you know. So I think that you know, the focus on game balance in 5th edition is sort of incompatible with OSR systems, in my opinion, up like after you hit a certain point. Like some balance is important no matter what, but it's just not to the degree that you see in games like 5th edition. So that's another major like backwards compatibility problem, you know?
Yeah. There was a really great blog post a couple of years back by Luca Reyes, who had this post where he described how D&D really isn't a game. It's games. It's like a series of different games that are all cobbled together. Because you have like a dungeon crawling game, you have like a hex crawling game, you can even have like a warfare game, you could have like economic games, and it's just all of these different games that are just cobbled together, and you use the ones that you want, which makes it just really easy for people to tack on new ones when they want to have a different kind of experience. So in that sense, you can add almost any kind of game mechanic to D&D, or old school D&D at least, because it doesn't really have that kind of core mechanic that you assume that everything works off of.
Mm-hmm. Dang, that was a tough question right there. That was a hard one.
Yeah, mostly just because I guess I really like the OSR style, so it's hard to think of stuff where it has like a giant hole that I want to fill.
Yeah,
I know. I'm gonna like sit up in the middle of the night and be like, oh, there was that one thing, but you know,
you're like, oh,
like
cats.
I'm disparaging.
There's not enough cats.
I know, we need more cats. Well, that is a really interesting point, because I think one thing that 5th edition does well that maybe old school systems overreached on was like 5th edition does not need to define every creature, or like there's like a certain amount of creatures that are statted out, but I think 5th edition moved away from Gygaxian naturalism a little bit, where you need to have like the stats for a mosquito and the stats for every kind of mouse. And so I think that was one thing that could be useful pulled back in time, is maybe like a little less structure to like every creature needing to be defined, you know, that might
like a zebra and a horse can probably use the same stat block kind of a thing.
Yeah, and like is the difference between them super essential. Yeah, so I mean, that's the best I got, you guys.
There's a great one of the articles in maybe the first Knock magazine is really great. It's just use bears. I don't know if you've heard of that.
Yes.
Yeah, if you just use a bear stat block, you can use that for like 90% of monsters, and people won't even notice.
No. Yeah,
just add a couple special abilities, but like this, you know, basic attack and hit points, you don't have to really change them.
This is so true.
They don't really know what's going on behind the screen.
Try it out.
Let's see.
I'm gonna build my bear NATO now. It'll come tearing through.
Bear NATO.
Let's see. Jeff wants to know, do you feel like it's worth bringing what you've learned from the OSR into 5e? So going the other direction, or are the two incompatible? I'm currently attempting to do this, so I'm very curious to hear success stories, if any, especially with regards to teaching 5e players the values inherent in OSR.
I mean, I think so. Like, there's lots of cool mechanics that we were just talking about a bunch.
Yeah.
And like that's if you like it. Like in Hot Springs Island, my players were really, my 5th edition players were really taken with the idea of the poker chips for day, night, and in between. And so I'd be like, oh, if you want to go to that hex, we're going to remove a poker chip because you had, 6 4-hour blocks. And then they knew how far they could get before they would actually need to rest. And then rolling for a watch was like, oh man. And that's something that wasn't, they were not aware of that. And they were like, oh, or if they took a short rest, I would move a chip. And then all of a sudden it was like, do we want to take a short rest or do we want to keep exploring? And that, I don't know. Yeah, that was new to them. So that's my example. There you go.
Love it. Yeah, like timekeeping stuff, which I think 5e could use more of. It's funny because this is the reverse of the last question, and I could probably like write a book on this particular, subject. But I think, well, actually, I have. I'm working on one, but I think that the question of are the two incompatible? I think without changes, yeah, because OSR style play is very much around resource management, and 5th edition kind of boils down to hand waving resource management when it wouldn't be interesting or fun because there's no particular system to make it interesting and fun. So I think that maybe like a simplified gear system for 5th edition where what you're carrying is easy to calculate, but also limited would be a way to bring in some OSR vibe, which is not so hard to do. And I think that this is my, I think that just not using skills at all, which I'm sure no 5th edition player would be on board with, but, you might be able to sneak it in under the table by being like, well, your character can use your proficiency bonus and stuff that you would be good at when you're making related ability checks. But I think that getting rid of skills is the first step in making your players problem solve outside of the menu of options on their character sheet. And that's what you want in OSR style play. So that would be my controversial major nuclear bomb to recommend.
Yeah, for me, that's like the biggest thing that, I'm just going to leave it blank. It just keeps going out for some reason.
You just put up a cool picture of yourself.
That's what I'll do. I think that's just what I'll do. But like when I've had 5th edition players and moving them into OSR, the biggest thing is what you said, when they're rolling a lot less than they were before, which is interesting because OSR has all these procedures like for dungeon crawling and for hex crawling that can make, the structure of 5e play a little bit more interesting. But oftentimes the biggest hurdle for them is not having to do as much or not having to roll as much. So they'll want to do something, they'll immediately pull out a die and I'll be like, don't roll the die, just tell me what you're doing. And half the time I'll just tell you the result. And that's an adjustment, but they usually catch on to that really quick. And they usually like how fast things run because they see how much of the outcome is dependent on just what they say and how they describe it. So they feel a lot more immersed, I think, because that's the impression I got from talking to them after. Yeah, so taking stuff out of 5e can, I think, be a good way to make it more OSR.
Yeah. Isn't that funny? Just cut some things and there you go.
People get surprised at how fast things go, especially combat. Like combat in OSR games can just be, 2 minutes long, and people are just not used to combat being not a big focus of the game.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, that's another big part of it. If you really want to go super OSR in 5th edition, just cut all your players' hit points in half and then watch them freak out, but then also realize how precious those hit points are and then start to second guess whether combat's really necessary.
Or just remove all the death saves. So it's like you get to 0 hit points, you die immediately.
Oh, yep. That's super scary.
Let's see here. Jordan Bracken wants to know, where do you turn for inspiration when you're not feeling excited for an upcoming RPG session? I feel like we answered that one a little bit already. Just talking about some of the types of books and, media sources you can look into. But also just looking at other OSR books, because often some of the really good settings are so packed with ideas, you can just flip through and just point to a random page and you'll find some cool idea there that you can just stick into your game. and that'll usually liven things up. And I think one of the big things is when you're prepping for a game and you're feeling overwhelmed, I'll put it a lot more onto the players instead of onto yourself, because players will often come up with really great ideas. If you just give them a really simple concept for an adventure, they'll often turn into something a lot more exciting, especially if you have things like random encounters in there. So it's easy for a game master who's used to prepping for 5e stuff to feel like overwhelmed that they have to plan everything out. But when you're doing OSR stuff, I think you can take a load off a lot more, and that can make things a little bit less stressful, I think.
Yeah, I do that all the time, but I have pretty improvisory friend players that really enjoy it. And I've had other players that do not enjoy this, but they'll say like, I'll be like, oh yeah, this, you know, I don't know, like young boy is running up to you in the village. And I'll be like, what does he look like? And they'll describe him. And I'm like, oh yeah. And then I'll say, and you notice something odd about him. What is it? And then all of a sudden they're giving me inspiration to use later on. And it's like, oh, he was actually, I don't know, a demon or something all along. And yeah, so it's lots of fun.
That's super cool. That's almost like them secretly telling you what they want to do that night.
Yeah.
You know, I like that a lot. Yeah.
And I've turned it on them too, where they are like, oh yeah, like this guy's or this or something. But then they've done it on me where they're like, well, that's my brother. It's like, oh yeah, I was not expecting that, but okay. So you're from this village, apparently. And so yeah.
That's
lots of
pretty
fun.
Cool. I really like that. I'm gonna try that. I haven't done that one. I'm gonna try that one out next time.
But then I've tried it on some friends and they're just like, you're the dungeon master. I was like, I am, but like I'm letting you make a choice. It's just kind of like an aesthetic or whatever. But
oh man,
yeah, that's an interesting one, because that's like the Dungeon World style. Dungeon World recommends you do that, where you turn a lot of the world building onto the players. You ask them questions and they give you answers and you incorporate it. And I've discovered that that's like a really interesting like balance you have to walk, like what you mentioned. There's some players that love that and some players that hate it.
Yeah.
So it's really hard to like, because some players just want to be immersed. And if you were telling them to do the world building, they're like, well, I'm not immersed anymore. Now I'm just like making the world up. But other players just love that cooperative attitude. So it's tricky. You have to figure out what they like.
Yeah, that is so true. And I think like I think almost any player, even if they're super into not actively participating in the world building, I mean, you still might have a little bit of backstory about their character that you can always pull from. Like I've done that in emergencies where, you know, I know a character has a brother that hasn't really come on screen yet, and you can always pull that as your ace up your sleeve for the night. If you're like, you see your brother across the tavern and, you know, I don't know, something like that, where you can hit the emergency button. I need something to do. And if you're pulling from an actual specific player's background, it doesn't seem like unplanned, you know, it doesn't seem like you just made it up. It seems like it's some part of your master plan as the dungeon master.
Yeah. I lost my train of thought. Let's just go on to the next question. I was about to say something, but it will come back to me in a second, I'm sure. Let's see. Michael Crow wants to know, how do you find the plot or story creation differs for OSR compared to 5e? OSR reads deadly and peculiar compared to the typical 5e adventures. So I think he's talking about like tone here, but I guess you could also think about the way that adventures are structured in the two different styles.
Right.
I feel like a lot of the 5e material that I've read is very much like here, I don't know, for some reason I'm literally thinking of Descent into Avernus, where once they get to Elturel in Avernus, that one of the things is like the party walks up and they find that there is a demon or a devil, and he's trying to buy the soul of this father, and so the father can get bread to feed his family, not realizing that they're in hell or something like that. And he's really desperate. And so it's like, what do you want to do? But the OSR stuff, or just they wouldn't do that. They would say, there is this character. It's a dad who's trying to feed his family and he's really desperate. And there's another character, a devil, he's looking for souls. And then it's up to you, the dungeon master, to put it together. And so you're like, oh, here are all these little tools I can play with, rather than here's a scene we've created for you to go play in. And I like that more because I get to create the scene with my characters, you know, because yeah. And so instead of like you're walking up to this, you get to say, oh, there's I don't know. And then I'm thinking of like Nightland I was reading recently, and Dragontown I was reading by J.P. Couvert, and that he does that where it's like, here's just a town, this is what's happening, and I like that a lot. So
yeah, I like that too. And I think like the difference again boils down to like what motivates the players, and it's different between 5e and old style games. I mean, like generally speaking, in old school games, the motivation is for the characters to get treasure so that they can get experience points. And in 5th edition, like treasure is like almost meaningless unless it's magical. Like gold really has no value. So I don't think that there needs to actually be a strong difference between both, as long as you know what's going to motivate the players. Like if you know, in 5th edition, like you could make the adventures about getting cool treasure. It just has to be the right kind that will make them want to go get it. So like magic items. And I think that there's a lot more like story driven adventures for 5th edition because there isn't a strong motivation to go out and get treasure typically. Whereas in old school games, like it's just kind of implicitly known that that's kind of what you're here to do. But I don't know. I don't know if that's down to just style or if it's like required by the formats. I think it's really just down to style at the end of the day.
Yeah, like the whole getting gold for experience points in old school games, though I guess you can, a lot of them have other ways to get XP as well. But generally it's gold, which means it really incentivizes players to be a lot more proactive and to kind of create the adventure themselves. Whereas if you don't have a consistent, concrete way of getting XP, then my experience of playing a 5e is that in any given session, you just kind of look at the game master and you're like, what are we supposed to do next? Because it's really up to the game master when the session ends and when you get enough XP to level up. And I guess you can kind of, you know, track XP for killing monsters, which 5e does have. But my experience is that most 5e groups basically do like milestone XP. That's pretty common. So it's, in terms of what do I do this session, is very much on the GM at all times. Whereas if you are, like what Jordan was saying, you create a situation instead of a plot where there's just things happening and there's treasure out there, but like, how are you going to get it? I don't know. I don't care. You figure it out. Then suddenly the players are really proactive and they're very engaged. And yeah, it creates a completely different style of play. I find it very frustrating when I'm playing a game and I have to like look at the game master and be like, what am I supposed to do next? Yeah, I just find that frustrating because I don't feel like I have as much choice or as much agency.
Right.
And so you're gonna have to design adventures very differently depending on those two styles.
You do. And I think it's just easier to do the open-ended style in old school games, but I don't think it's impossible in 5th edition games. So some 5th edition writers out there, you should give it a shot. See if you can. I'll try to. You know,
there's no reason you can't do like gold for XP in 5th edition. Like there's no reason you couldn't do that.
Or figure out a way to present something that's so open-ended without any driving plot, and you know, give the characters or the players something they want, which can be identified, and figure out how to motivate them towards that in a more open-ended way. I think it's possible. I just think it's less common.
Yeah. You could even do stuff like, a way to make players have a little bit more agency is to just ask them, like at the end of each session, what they want to do next session. So you can still have milestone XP or milestone levels that way, because it's like whenever you complete your next mission, you'll get a level. But players are still picking what their mission is, so they're not looking at the game master as much. They're being more self-directed, and that makes prep easier for the game master because they know what to prep for next session. The players say, I want to go investigate that ruin that we learned about. Well, there's our next session. And it's not as railroady, but
and that kind of goes back to that first question we just did, where they're like, how do you not have like, or get back to base camp in a way? And so if you do that, where you're like, okay, we're back, what do you guys want to do next week? That's what I'm going to prep, and then everyone's excited for what they're going to do next week. And so
as long as they don't change their mind, no backsies.
Which I've had that happen. Yeah.
Once you tell the game master what you're going to do, no backsies, because that's what I've prepared.
Backsies. You will do this adventure.
Having fun.
You decided what the fun was. I made
Chad, are you
for
having
fun.
fun with your choices? Roll the dice.
Let's see. Okay. Catholic Dragoon asks, here's a general question. What do some ideas or concepts for a setting, or what are some ideas or concepts for a setting that you think are underused?
You know,
I know some
everyone,
that are overused, but
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
overused. Yeah.
very, very. But like everyone's like, I'm gonna make an underwater world, but has anyone actually? I mean, I'm sure someone
Yeah.
has, but I mean, someone do it. You know, that's one that I hear everyone saying would be cool, but no one that I'm aware of has done a ton of that.
I'm betting, I mean, is it because you have to think about 3-dimensional movement? I feel like that would be a huge pain. It would be
Yes.
like giving everyone flight in like a normal D&D game.
Yeah, that would be hard. That would be challenging, but possible. But I mean, you'd probably have to completely redesign the underwater movement rules. Otherwise it would be so arduous. But yeah, I mean, how much of a challenge would that be? Like designing a campaign with the assumption of 3D movement, like that would be cool.
Yeah, you'd have to find a way to track vertical movement. I mean, because it'd be hard to put obstacles in players' way if you're doing, traveling from point A to point B. They can just swim over any obstacles that you put in their way, because they wouldn't have to travel along the ground.
Yeah,
That'd
you
be
couldn't
tricky.
do ordinary stuff. It would have to be very designed. It would have to be really thought out. Uh-oh. Don't give me ideas.
You could do it in like
Now I'm like,
underwater
huh.
caverns, because that would like
Yeah.
restrict where they could go to some degree.
Yeah, currents could play a role. I mean, like area effects, nets. I mean, nets. We all know nets are really bad for aquatic life. I mean,
And to that effect, I
Dang.
guess like air as well, like hot air balloons and dirigibles and like flying structures and stuff. I've read a couple supplements that use things like that, but they're not
Yeah.
super common, I guess. I don't know. But that's something I like, is the idea of air pirates and stuff flying around. And then from there, you could say space as well, as we're getting a space setting for D&D coming out. But
Yeah, I've never played.
But like-
played Spelljammer. I don't know how you would handle that with tracking, because I assume that in Spelljammer, all your ships can have 3D movement, right?
yeah, they do. But they, for simplicity's sake, when you're in a ship combat, like if my ship is fighting someone else's ship, they do it on a hex grid. And in the book, it just straight up says like, this is too annoying to really calculate, so we're just going to do hexes, and there you go. But if you have clever players who are like, the enemy ship is down and they figure out a way of getting some kind of advantage with that, I would lead into it. But
wow, that's cool.
Yeah. Trying to think of other things that are underused.
But I'm like,
Yeah.
caves, deserts, jungles, Arctic, like those are not underused. Like those are
No.
overused all the time because it's what we have. So maybe
Right. And-
dreams, maybe like a dreamscape kind of thing would be kind of interesting.
oh yeah, yeah.
I just finished, well, I didn't just, but it's a movie I've been thinking about a lot, which is Everything Everywhere All at Once, which is a really awesome movie. I highly recommend it. But it's a multiverse of possibilities in that movie. And the main villain will just like click her head and shift over to herself in another universe. And I want to do something like that with a game. I've been thinking about a lot is this idea of like, I can run away from the monster, but what I'm actually doing is like jumping through other multiverses and then you can do all sorts of weird stuff. I guess Doctor Strange just did it too in their movie that came out. So
Some inspiration right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the only
See,
thing
you
I
got to
can-
take the ideas you get and use
Yes.
them in D&D. It's not stealing, it's reworking. No, but it really is like, it really is reworking. It's legitimate. Dang, there's certainly stuff that's overused. Like,
I mean, in the OSR, it's mostly like Dying Earth stuff. Like Dying Earth is so cool. There's like, because you can put everything in there: science, fantasy, gonzo. There's like no limits. But then that all becomes its own genre, and everyone does it. So it's sometimes nice to have something a little bit more focused than that.
yeah.
Sword
And
and
like, I
sorcery.
love
But now
sword
I
and sorcery.
really am
Yeah.
thinking a lot about your underwater city, because I'm like, I don't think I
I am too.
have. Like now I'm like, that
This is a
probably is really
problem.
underutilized, where I'm like, I don't know of any underwater city stuff.
You know when you know you're gonna end up writing something, even though you don't want to, but you're going because you're like, no, I don't have time for that. It's probably gonna happen now.
I know Zarkov Kowalski has an underwater city adventure. Maybe if you did something, it was like in a shallow lake so that you couldn't have too much 3D movement. If you're like at the bottom of the ocean, I feel like it's just way too much. But if you're in like a shallower lake, so you have some 3D movement, but
well,
not
no,
as
what
much.
if you float though, like at the bottom of the ocean? So actually you have to wear ankle weights to keep you down there so you can adventure. Like if you take these off, you're going to shoot up so fast or something. Because
That's a good idea.
I don't know. It's like super dense water in the bottom of the ocean, so you can't just go without your what I'm thinking of, like a flotation device without your sinkable device. You need to have your sinks on, like
your floaties. No, your sinkies.
TM sinks trademark. Okay, there you go.
And that's your emergency escape equipment too. It's just like
you take it
and
off,
flying back up to the surface,
and get the bends, and then it's awful for you. So
that'd be awesome.
Well, that's it. We got to do an underwater adventure now.
Let's write it.
Yeah. Let's see. One more question here. This one's from Bob World Builder, who has another YouTube channel. And he wants to know if you had to choose between playing only in Homebrew of your own design or only in a published setting of your choice for the rest of your days, what would you choose and why?
I mean, I think, so this is a big question for me, because I get a lot of people that are like, I think 70% of D&D players play in their own world. It's a smaller than you would think for how much attention like the Forgotten Realms gets in Eberron and all these campaign settings. Everyone really does make up their own worlds. But I'm going to go back to like modules. Like I miss little 30-page adventures, which is kind of what the OSR is doing really well, because of shared experience. Like I can run the Tomb of Horrors, Kelsey can run the Tomb of Horrors, and then we meet up at a convention and it's like, do you have a Tomb of Horrors story? Because I have a Tomb of Horrors story. We all talk about it. It's awesome. And that is something that I think is very important in the tabletop RPG scene or world, because people will go see movies, they'll listen to musical albums, they'll play video games, they'll read books, and then they sit down together and they have something to talk about. But if I am like, okay, like how did your D&D session go last night? And you're like, oh man, it was so cool. Like we did this and we fought this. And it's like, I don't know any of the characters. I don't really know what you're doing. But if you stop dropping certain things like Orcus or Acererak or Vecna, then it's like, oh, I recognize that. I know what it is. So having kind of like a collective character base, I think is important, which is why I value the Forgotten Realms. Like it's a very overdone kind of setting in that way. Like they're trying to do like a catch-all for everything. Like I get that. And one could argue that it would be more interesting to play in something that you are writing yourself, so the players are not expecting something out of it. So I don't think I have an answer, but I mean, I guess play with, I think I would like to go the road less traveled and actually play in somebody's homebrew as opposed to, I don't know, the realms for the rest of my life. That just seems boring. So.
Yeah, wow, you make such a persuasive case, because I think the idea of like shared experience is really big. Like that's where all of the in jokes are from, and
exactly.
Like, everything that we all laugh about together is generally based on a shared experience joke. So that, like, you know, that's giving that up would be very challenging, and you know, maybe not a happy thing, but I have a perfect.
I used to do a Patreon hangout where I would hang out with my patrons and we'd do video chats, and two of them had played through Curse of Strahd and I hadn't, and they just started like making inside jokes and all this other stuff, and like they had never met before, but by the end of that, like, I don't know, hour-long conversation we had, they were like best friends because they had that shared experience of Strahd between them, and they both run Strahd and they both knew all of these silly things, and it was like, what did you do here? And I think that's super valuable. Like, and I like that we have that with I guess the monster manual is the closest thing you'll get, because people recognize those monsters. And I keep thinking about the D&D movie they're going to try and make, and I was like, you can't focus on any of the heroes. heroes are going to be a dime a dozen, like recast them every movie, but you need to have like Vecna is the villain for like all 3 movies or something. Like Thanos is important as a character, you know, as opposed to the Guardians of the Galaxy. Whatever, recast him. That's fine.
Dang, that's such an interesting, that's such a persuasive argument. So that makes it more challenging. Like my knee-jerk reaction was to be like, well, homebrew, because that's kind of how I play already, I guess, when I like sprinkle in modules. But if that means at the exclusion of modules, that might change my mind, because like how many people would have, like how many people have started their D&D like career on like Keep on the Borderlands, or like how many people have like entered the OSR because of Keep on the Borderlands, you know, like that's just, don't take that one away, you know.
Yeah, and for Dungeon Crawl Classics, that community is all about modules, and it's this like rite of passage when you finally played Sailors on the Starless Sea. And then as you're like, I've played this to hell and back, they're like, but have you played it in reverse? And then all of a sudden you go to a con and they're just like, you could play it in reverse? Like what? And so I don't know, like it's this weird nerd leveling system within Dungeon Crawl Classics where it's like, oh, I've played all of these, or I've ran these that I don't see in other places. Or even in the OSR in general, I guess. There's not a lot of like, oh, I've ran Hot Springs Island or Nightland or blah, blah, blah. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's a tricky question. I mean, I think I would have to just run my own world, mostly because I'm really bad at keeping track of lore in other universes.
Yeah.
You know,
Make it up.
I can make it up. Is it still the same world though? If it's like you're making up all of the lore for it?
I guess not, but we're not all playing on a video game server. So I'm always like, make it your own. Like, I don't know. Like, I like that there's enough similarities for us to kind of collectively understand what a water deep is, or, you know, what a chult is, kind of a thing. But at the same time, I don't know, like, yeah, the demons won. You know, they're walking the Underdark. They came up out of the ground. What are you going to do now? And that's not canon, but like, who cares? So,
yeah,
I do think Eberron got it right, where every game is just 2 years after the war ended, and they don't have a timeline. They didn't try to have like a living Eberron like they did with the Forgotten Realms and Greyhawk, which is what really caused a problem. Is all these novels happened. And then it's like, well, is this happening now or after Drizzt saved the world? Where are we at? And it's like, doesn't matter. There is no Drizzt. Just go play. Yeah. Like, who cares? Or if you want him to be there, he's a retired shop owner now. I don't know. Like, so.
Do you think
ultimate fate?
Do you think the movie is going to be set in the Forgotten Realms?
Yes.
Wouldn't it have to be?
It's on the Sword Coast. They've announced that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Because they own the rights to like literally everything. But yeah, I guess Forgotten Realms is the most logical.
I'm really curious to see how they're going to structure a D&D movie. Like,
my hope. Really now we're just talking. But
I know. That's totally fine. This is our last question. What do you think they're going to do in the D&D movie, and what do you want them to do?
I want it to be like, sorry, did you see the Lego movie? I thought the Lego movie was handled very well.
Oh yeah.
And the Lego movie, it's like the stakes are very high for the Lego character and all this other stuff. And then midway you realize it's sorry, spoilers for the Lego movie, but midway you realize it's a kid who's playing with his Legos, and he has other problems with his, you know, like his actual life that he's acting out with his Legos. I almost want that. And I don't necessarily want them to be like 10-year-old Stranger Things kids playing D&D, and that's like the twist at the end. But the idea that, wow, it's really important and it's high stakes for us in our game, but at the same time, so-and-so died, I'll roll up a new character. And it's like, we all have that, like, we all remember the story we had together at the table, and that's what's important. So that's what I want out of it. And then lots of like CG dragons and stuff, because that'll be fun.
Yes, I want that too. I want there to be like a frame story, because I think like the whole experience of D&D requires that. And if it doesn't have it, it's just like another fantasy story, you know? So I would love that. And then that's like, there's so much opportunity for a little bit of humor with that too, like a little bit of lightheartedness, you know? So I think that's what I'm hoping for, but we'll see.
Yeah, it would be hilarious to watch it. And I don't want to hear a dice roll in the background, but like to know that this cocky guy got up there to do an axe swing and he's like, oh, that was a natural one. Like that you could just tell, like, that's hilarious. Critical Role's show was very much, which I thought was very good, their animated series that they did, but it was just, here's a story in this fantasy world. There was nothing D&D about it. And I think that's because they were like, well, here's the characters and here's the story. And we played through this story, but like, there wasn't that like, oh, it's a game, or, oh, like we're all having a shared experience in some way. So I hope that the movie does that, because I think it's important. And I think that'll help sell their game too. So we'll see.
Yeah. It would be really funny if like Chris Pine's character dies in the middle of the movie, and then like Chris Pine 2 just like walks in the next door.
It has to be Chris
I
Pine.
want that so bad.
That's the way.
I'm the son of Chris Pine. I'm just taking
like,
over where we left
my
off.
name is Chris Piner, and I'm his long lost twin brother. We just have different last names. I don't know. It's so funny. That would be great.
This is a classic trope, and we need it.
Yeah.
What I would love, that they're probably not going to do, I would love the D&D movie to be like a mega dungeon heist, where the entire movie is inside a dungeon and they're just trying to like get something and survive, and they structure it like a heist movie. They probably won't. I suspect that like the movie is going to have very little in the way of Dungeons or Dragons. It will probably have both, but I would love to see a movie that's just like, it's called Dungeons and Dragons, we're just in a dungeon the whole time.
Yeah.
I think that would be hilarious.
I love it. Haha, we're in the dungeon.
It reminds me of like Galaxy Quest, where they're going through the ship and there's all these weird things that are like flying down, and they're like, why is the ship designed like this? And it's like, well, it was to be stupid and interesting. It like wasn't meant to be functional. And so that could be the same thing. The players are just like, who designs a dungeon like this? Like, what is the purpose? Purpose
one
is
ludicrous
you.
death trap after another. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
It's always a crazy wizard.
A wizard did it. It's always the answer.
I love it.
All right. I think we're going to wrap up there. Thank you, Jordan and Kelsey, for joining me. This has been a lot of fun. Anyone watching, make sure to check the description below. I will put links to both of their channels. I've been subscribed to them for a while, and you should too, because they're really great channels. And thanks everyone for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.